is an objective fact that the 90s produced some legendary FPS titles. What's more, some of them still hold up extremely well today. Sure, you might need a source port here and there to make sure they play nice on modern hardware at modern resolutions, but it's telling that there's more than enough old school revivals either in the works or since released to say that what worked about FPS games back then still works now. With that in mind, I bring you CULTIC, a solo developer effort with more than a little blood staining its sleeves. Taking place at some point during the 60s, CULTIC sees an investigator take matters into his own hands after being unceremoniously removed from a case, looking into a spate of mysterious disappearances. They all seem to revolve around a foreboding mental asylum somewhere out in the sticks, but no sooner has our intrepid protagonist arrived at the asylum gates does he find himself left for dead with nothing but a pile of corpses for company. Brutal. So begins an odyssey of melon-popping violence as CULTIC swiftly introduces you to the joys of taking a hatchet, among a variety of other weapons, to the veritable army of cultists that stand in the way of you and the truth. As far as first impressions go, CULTIC certainly has a distinctive style to it, what with its crunchy texture and sprite work, wrapped up in a very grungy color scheme that I freely admit wasn't particularly my cup of tea to begin with, but it was something that I soon acclimatized to and eventually appreciated as something that certainly helps CULTIC stand out and carve its own visual identity from. Interestingly, you'll discover that there's a fair few things during the course of an average CULTIC level that you can pick up, throw, break, or interact with. And yes, that also includes chucking around the occasional cultist head. While most of the interactability you'll be engaging with will involve breaking crates to get to secrets behind, occasionally it can have interesting implications, such in the midst of combat. A lamp may fall, break, and cause a hazardous pool of flame to spread across the immediate area. As for the explosive barrels, well, we all know how that one works. In terms of navigation and movement, the protagonist here turns out to be surprisingly nimble. And I say surprising because at first, there's a weightiness to the standard movement. And if anything, this grants a tangible sense of momentum to what happens when you start hitting sprint. You can build up a serious head of steam here, not to mention take advantage of a near comical jump height combined with a rather wonderful knee slide that not just provides a speedy way of getting under small gaps, but allowing you also to introduce yourself into combat with an almost John Woo degree of flair. Speaking of combat, when it comes to weaponry, everything here seems era-appropriate. First level, for example, introducing you to the likes of the Mauser handgun, the lever-action rifle, and of course, the double-barrel sawn-off shotgun. Oh, and let's not forget the TNT. Very much the meat and potatoes of the CULTIC arsenal for the first few maps here, and ones that will see you well when it comes to spilling cultist blood. From a raw, visceral standpoint, the guns here are just a heck of a lot of fun. The handgun cracks like a whip, the double-barrel shotgun just absolutely slaps, and cultist heads pop like melons. Explosions, be it from nearby barrels or an expertly placed bundle of dynamite, have a tangible power to them, utterly eviscerating lower tier enemies, and every now and again, just to put a blood-soaked exclamation point on the moment, the game will bless you with an instance of glorious mid-combat slow-mo. It certainly doesn't hurt then that everything built atop this mountain of combat madness is impressively well-designed stuff. CULTIC goes to great lengths to ensure that its combat doesn't just boil down to linear encounters. I mean, sure, there are instances of that during a level's more atmospheric and spooky moments, and trust me, we'll get to those, but in its more adrenaline-soaked encounters, CULTIC opens everything up into what I can only describe as a delightful combat playground. The hallmark of these sections, in my opinion, is variety of approach, designed to facilitate not just the more cautious stop-and-pop, cover-conscious player, but also the raging lunatic that charges everywhere full pelt, chucking dynamite between knee slides while hosing down enemies with the stand. Can you guess which method I prefer? Near enough every level during the course of CULTIC features, if not one, multiple varieties of Combat Playground, yet each feels sufficiently different from the last to cause you to at least think about your potential approach to it rather than simply going through the motions. Part of this is, of course, down to the explicit design of these sections, varying things up in layout that doesn't just take advantage of the horizontal aspect of the levels, but occasionally peppering in a pleasing degree of verticality. An early standout that certainly sticks in my memory in that regard would be this subterranean pit area featuring a fortified central camp atop an earthen pillar and this wonderfully spiraling minecart track that tracks the outer edge. Guess what? You can ride the cart, and you know what? It turns out to be a pretty fun way of taking out some of those more long-range cultists that may otherwise have troubled you from the perches. In terms of enemy types, surprisingly for a game called CULTIC, there are a lot of cultists. To its credit, the game does try to add variation to the visual design of these to help differentiate one type from another. For example, different color robes to help tell what kind of weapon they wield, and as you progress deeper, you'll spot armored and more tangibly chunkier cultists that take a little bit more punishment to bring down and may cause you to utilize cover a little bit more often. Sometimes, though, the information of which enemy is which can get a little lost amidst the crunchiness of the visuals and the chaos of combat, but in truth, most of the time I was having too much fun to care. The more monstrous enemy types, however, suffer much less from that problem of identification, notably because they often take the form of these just hulking, skull-faced monstrosities. The Chainsaw Psycho, in particular, is a particularly well-utilized monster type. Used sparingly as a shock ambush, this type almost never failed when it came to putting me on panic footing. It's just got one of those blends of wonderfully dangerous attributes. For one, a tanky pool of health, one that, if it gets low enough, will cause the enemy to speed up, and if that chainsaw connects, it's not just a chunk of damage taken off you, no, it sticks. Seriously, it requires a fair bit of jostling to free yourself from its grip, and that thing can reduce you to zero in fairly swift time. It's something you don't soon forget after your first death at its hands, making each successive encounter just these tension-filled, often claustrophobic ordeals. Turning to the subject of health, supplies are actually quite plentiful throughout the course of CULTIC. A fair degree of enemies whilst playing this on standard difficulty will actually drop a small bit of health resupply. And after a point, any excess goes into a medbag that can be used to top yourself up at any time. It certainly feels like a choice made to keep you focused on forging ahead within combat, essentially giving you carte blanche to play a little bit more aggressively, knowing you won't really have to scour the area too hard in order to patch up any holes. And trust me, if you're playing this as fast and loose as I was, you're going to be relying on that med supply fairly often. As alluded to earlier, CULTIC finds plenty of time between its combat playgrounds to slow things down somewhat, build some atmosphere, and in general, get spooky. For the most part, you know exactly when you're about to embark on a spooky section during the course of CULTIC because the previous bombast of the soundtrack during the course of the more action-orientated sections will drop away, and in some cases find themselves replaced with low, droning atmospherics. You'd think this would be the equivalent of a large neon sign saying prepare yourself for shenanigans, but the truth is, when it comes to good, effective spookiness, most of it is in the build-up and the anticipation. It certainly doesn't hurt that caves, mines, abandoned industrial complexes, and let's not forget, insane asylums are inherently spooky places. So how exactly does CULTIC fare on that particular front? Well enough. I was sufficiently perturbed. If anything, I was more intrigued in what exactly the cult was up to here, and that mystery is actually maintained quite well, almost right up until the final moments of this particular chapter. But worry not, there won't be any significant story spoilers here. Instead, I will say I was always interested to discover notes and journal entries, some covering the perspective of the miners who could just about comprehend that something terrible was about to happen to them, or probably the most fascinating in my opinion, that of an investigator infiltrating the ranks of the cult itself and finding himself drawn ever deeper. But going back to that aforementioned spookiness, it certainly helps lay the groundwork for the occasional effective moment. Gingerly creeping your way past bear traps only to find the bodies hanging from the ceiling suddenly springing to life. And let's not forget the first time I found a barrel levitating and careening supernaturally into my face. Interestingly, the root of this telekinesis-based abuse can be summarily dealt with a shot to the face. And you'd think after the first encounter, an enemy type such as this would somewhat diminish its spook value over time, and in a sense you'd be correct, doubly so considering how weak they are, but CULTIC still finds fun ways to keep this particular enemy type in play, be it through devious hiding spots in various other spooky areas, or even by integrating them into the more action-orientated sections of CULTIC, where the line of sight ability to slow you down and deal consistent damage can actually provide a bit of a danger when combined with other enemy types. Thankfully, by later points in the chapter here, the weapon roster has fleshed itself out pretty well, what with the addition of the FG-42 taking up the long-range sniper slot, the grenade launcher taking up the Things Go Boom slot, and eventually Molotovs and the Incinerator taking up the Oh God Killer Fire slot. As it happens, that last one is almost indispensable when it comes to taking on those hulking monstrosities. Crowds of the Walking Dead, too, or quite possibly my most despised enemy in all of CULTIC, the goddamn shield cultist. They just suck. I don't think I've come across any game as of yet with a shield-bearing enemy that doesn't just stop you dead in your tracks and just turn out to be a massive pain in the ass. So yeah, eat flame. Or even better, the alt fire for the Incinerator, which charges up this massive firebomb of a projectile. Oh, and just because I can't believe I haven't mentioned it already by this point, boy oh boy is it satisfying to trigger a bundle of TNT with a well-placed shot. Seriously, CULTIC grants you quite a lot of flexibility when it comes to its chuggables. By default, a bundle of TNT is thrown without lighting the fuse. You have to make a conscious decision to trigger that alt and light it beforehand before you throw. Same goes with the Molotovs, though I've always found those harder to actually spark after the fact. It's a choice that ultimately allows you to lay traps as the enemy comes towards you, or conversely, if you're feeling particularly apocalyptic, you can even use a tertiary fire option to tie a bundle of TNT to a Molotov for the added benefit of burning everything to death that didn't immediately explode into meaty chunks. Seriously, it's great. In all honesty, beyond the shield cultists, I'm genuinely finding it hard to come up with things that annoy or disappoint me about CULTIC. I guess the brevity of the available chapter here could count as a gripe, because from what I can tell, CULTIC is being actively marketed as CULTIC Chapter 1, and my standard difficulty run, for example, coming in just shy of 2.5 hours. Now, obviously, that's just my experience. Your particular mileage may vary, and certainly the runtime will lengthen depending on how eager you are to go sniffing for secrets, of which there are many, and in some cases, well worth seeking out, because they'll provide you with the likes of weapon upgrade parts, which will enhance your damage dealing, your overall mag capacity, accuracy, you know, the usual suspects. Not to mention, there's also permanent health upgrades to be found in the form of imbued skulls. Potentially extending playtime outside of the campaign, there is also the presence of survival mode. Currently, there's 3 available arenas within this mode, and features a reasonably interesting gameplay loop where successive waves will grant you with more and more cash, but it'll need to be spent carefully to ensure that you balance the needs of more powerful weaponry with the ammunition that you'll need to actually utilize them. It's deceptively challenging, probably more so than the average wave survival mode I've come across recently, and if you find yourself particularly taken with it, it also boasts online leaderboards for you to compare your performance versus your friends. So yeah, I think it's safe to say that this was a real fun time. Tremendously enjoyable, satisfying as heck combat, real nice utilization of blood-style dynamite tossing, and when it needed to be, effectively spooky. I'm honestly left craving more from CULTIC, and that's more than just a consequence of its slight runtime. It's quality work, and that's even more impressive when you remind yourself that this is the product of a solo dev effort. So, you know what? I can forgive the runtime. If this is the level of quality I can come to expect from subsequent entries in CULTIC, so be it, even if it is in 2.5 hour chunks. But yeah, another feather in the cap for 3D Realms. They are, in my opinion, doing good by the name. They don't need to do much. Just keep releasing old school bangers like this and we'll be good. No pressure. As for when and where you can get your hands on CULTIC Chapter 1, it should be available right now on Steam. And now that I've been able to have a peek at the retail price, which I didn't have access to before this officially released, yeah, well worth it. Easily. Hard recommend. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this review. It's not something I'm able to do very often, but if you liked it, feel free to let me know in the comments, and I'll try and do more of them. Because, quite frankly, I need to practice, and it lights a fire under my backside to get stuff done. Anyway, that's it from me. Please consider supporting my Patreon so I don't have to worry about YouTube ad rev. And until next time, this has been Mr. Icarus. Thank you very much for watching. Icarus out.